Washington Journal continues.
We're back with John O'Neill and Sarah Wynne, co-authors of the new book, The Dancer and the Devil, Stalin, Pavlova, and the Road to the Great Pandemic. We're so happy to have y'all here with us this morning. First of all, can you tell us how this book came about? Why did y'all write this book, and why now?
For sure, Jesse. First of all, on this Memorial Day, I'd like to remember my friends at the Naval Academy and a lot of other friends who gave their life in service of our country. I guess Memorial Day is tomorrow. We wrote this book, I think, for three reasons. First of all, we wanted to commemorate the people whom Stalin, Putin, and Xi tried to obliterate from history. People like the great dancer Pavlova, probably history's greatest dancer, the Nobel Prize winner in China, Li Xiaobo, China's first Nobel Prize winner who died in prison in China, and a slew of people that Putin has killed. The second big reason we wrote the book is to tell people about two wolves that are loose in the world. That is Putin and Xi, the descendants, at least spiritually and ideologically, of Stalin. When I grew up, my father told me many times how they had tried so hard in the 1930s to tell people about Stalin, what a terrible threat he was, and how if people had listened, they could have avoided the slaughter that occurred in Europe, but nobody listened. And so we wrote the book in the hope that people will listen to who Putin and Xi really are and how they regard human life. And the third reason we wrote it is to alert people to the weapons that they actually have, which are bioweapons and created diseases. And they're outlined at great length. These pose as much of a threat to mankind, to all of us, as nuclear weapons. And they're discussed in our book, The Dancer and the Devil. Those are the three primary reasons we wrote the book, Jesse.
Now, Sarah, let's get a little historical context here. In the book, you talk about Laboratory One. Can you tell us what Laboratory One is and why Stalin established it?
Sure. Sure. It was created in 1921 by Stalin to really execute what's called Litternoi poisonings or Litternoi killings. So they developed, it was really the first bio-war lab, and went on to kill Anna Pavlova, the short story writer Maxim Gorky, the ambassador Raoul Wallenberg, and many other people we reference in The Dancer and the Devil.
The purpose of it was to have deniable killings. There are people, Stalin killed perhaps 20 million, and people would disappear, but there are people that can't simply disappear, that they're too prominent. And at the same time, you don't want the public dislike for having killed them. And so what you do is stage what are called natural deaths or stage suicides. You actually get them and you simulate a natural disease like a respiratory disease. Stalin used anthrax. Or heart failure. Stalin used potassium and used curare. Or a stage suicide. Recently in the Ukraine, 7 different oligarchs have supposedly committed suicides, the last 3 with their entire families. Those weren't suicides, Jesse. Those were Litternoi murders. Those were people who were dissenting against Putin, and so they murdered them. And they murdered them in a way that was deniable.
Now, we're talking about bioweapons here, but I want to be sure everyone knows what we are talking about. So can you tell us what a bioweapon is? What exactly are we talking about, either one of you?
Yeah, a bioweapon, maybe it's easiest to take an example. A bioweapon is simply an organic as opposed to an inorganic poison. In the case of just take Stalin, anthrax was a bioweapon that he favored. Also, pneumonic plague, smallpox, and a variety of other diseases. With anthrax, you took a little breath of it, and these are bacterial spores that would get in your lungs, and they would simulate pneumonia. And so people would take a breath of them from a napkin, as likely happened to Pavlova, and all of a sudden you were diagnosed as having pneumonia. Well, you didn't have pneumonia, you actually had anthrax in your lungs, but the pathology of the time was not sufficient to show the difference. Likewise, curare is an almost indetectable poison that was used to simulate heart failure. In that case, an inorganic deal. Stalin had a entire massive set of biolabs beginning at a place called Saratov and in a project called the Anthrax Anti-Plague Project. In 1939, he summoned the head of that project, a guy named Abram Berlin, into Moscow. And Berlin began coughing at the Hotel Nacional. The doctor came and he said, "My God, Abram, you've got pneumonic plague. You have a disease we haven't seen in Moscow in nearly 300 years. Everyone that saw Berlin died because pneumonic plague, and those days not only was communicable but was untreatable. So a bioweapon is simply engineering a disease to hurt people, either on a retail level, as Stalin did, or now on a much greater level, as Putin and Xi are doing. Mostly in the past, these have always been traditional diseases like smallpox, plague, anthrax. Now, the horror with CRISPR, the so-called CRISPR tool, is you can actually manufacture viruses. So you can take a virus and you can actually adapt it or change it. So if we look at the COVID-19 virus, which has killed 19 million people, 96.2% of it is from a bat located out in the Himalayas, 1,100 miles from Wuhan. But 3.8% of it has never been found naturally in nature anywhere. So someone has added that 3.8%. Claims have been made that it resulted from evolution, but no one has ever found that natural virus anywhere in nature at all. And so you have the horror of bioweapons as Stalin had them, but now manufactured by the horror that you can actually adapt genes. So mankind now has the capacity to kill itself, insanely as that sounds.
Now, Sarah, go ahead, Sarah.
I said, as we discussed in The Dancer and the Devil, this Stalinist Marxist ideology has spread to North Korea and to China, and it poses an incredible threat. We learned in the course of our research, we spent 4 years researching this book, that the Russian army spends 1 of every 5 days in full hazmat suits. The only reason that they would do that would be to be prepared for a chemical or biological attack that they themselves would release. We do hear a lot about the threat of nuclear weapons, but we think it's important that people know the threat of biological weapons is equally important.
Now, Sarah, we've heard her name a couple of times this morning. It's on the cover of the book, but some of our viewers might not know who Anna Pavlova was and how she died. Can you tell us who Anna Pavlova was and what did you find out about how she died?
I can. We fell in love with her in the course of researching her. She was the world's most beautiful ballerina, gifted ballerina, and she traveled the world astoundingly 400,000 miles in the days before air travel. She went to 44 different countries. She was most famous for her dance, The Dying Swan, and she traveled, like I say, to 44 countries, often introducing ballet for the first time. She was killed in Paris by a gang called the Yasha Gang that Stalin created, a poison lab. And she ate her food at the Ritz in Paris, her lunch, and boarded the train for The Hague. And she said, "I've been poisoned by the food I ate in Paris." Well, it would be another 60+ years before the Yasha Gang was discovered, and so people thought she couldn't have been poisoned. She must be coming down with a bug, and they even alleged that she'd stood in the rain briefly or something like that. So they treated her symptoms instead of poisoning, and she did die. Astoundingly, 37 biographies have been written about her, and no one has alleged that she was killed by Stalin. But I believe in our book, The Dancer and the Devil, we present a very strong case that that's exactly what happened.
Now, do you have conclusive evidence that she was killed by Stalin?
The evidence we have is, first of all, that in 1927, Stalin caused an article to be written in the Soviet press that alleged that she was an enemy of the Soviet people. He passed a law. He invited her to return to Russia. Before that, she refused to return. He confiscated her entire trust she had set up to aid orphans in Russia. He got his woman who was likely his mistress named Anna Kollontai, and Kollontai in 1930 traveled throughout Europe, trying to get European countries not to allow Anna Pavlova to perform there. They laughed at her, and she did that directly at Stalin's request. In 1931, late 1930, Anna Pavlova told everyone that she was under a sword of Damocles, that she felt like she would soon die. She asked her friends to pray for her. We have many different instances in the book of other people being poisoned with anthrax by the Yasha group set up in Paris by Stalin. Stalin sent to Paris a man named Sergei Spiegelglass, the greatest Litinoid poisoner in the world. He sent him to Paris specifically for the purpose of wiping people out. He pretended to be a fishmonger, but his job was to poison people. And so many people died exactly as Pavlova did, supposedly with pneumonia, but always with anthrax. Pavlova boarded a train after eating at the Ritz Hotel. And the first thing she said when she climbed on the train was, "I've been poisoned in Paris." And she slowly sunk, her lungs slowly filled up with water. She kept telling people she was poisoned, but who on earth, Jesse, would ever poison the most loved ballerina in the world? And as she died, she called for her swan costume. She made the sign of the cross. She swore her group to go forward the very next night, defying Stalin in The Hague. And so they danced, putting a light in each place on the stage where she was to dance, because there was no one in the world who could take her place. So there is virtually, I could try that case, Jesse. I tried hundreds of cases. I could try that case 100 times, Jesse. I wouldn't lose a single time. I would win every single time on the case of whether Stalin directed the poisoning of Pavlova. Stalin was consumed with ballet. He had a box in the Bolshoi that overlooked the stage. He directed the death of various composers and ballerinas in Russia itself who didn't please him. In 1924, a composer in 25 showed actually the old ballets of Russia, the Nutcracker and Swan Lake, and so he immediately was consigned to by Stalin to an insane asylum and then killed. Stalin regarded ballet as integral to his total control of message and of history.
Well, and Jesse, John brings up a good question. Who in the world would want to kill a beautiful ballerina that inspired millions? Stalin believed in a doctrine called cultural hegemony that was first presented by Gramsci. To control man, he believed you had to control everything about man. You had to control even the words that were used. He said by 1935 the word God will not be used in Russia. He believed you had to control the theater and the arts. And Pavlova, through her incredible artistic ability and knowing no bounds, was the ultimate symbol of artistic freedom. It was exactly what Stalin couldn't stand for.
Let me take a second here to remind our viewers that they can take part in this conversation. We're going to open up regional lines, which means that if you are in the Eastern or Central time zones, your number is going to be 202-748-8000. If you are in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, your number is going to be 202-748-8001. Keep in mind, you can always text us at 202-748-8003, and we're always reading on social media, on Twitter at C-SPAN-WJ, and on Facebook at facebook.com/C-SPAN. So we've now talked about the past. I want y'all to draw a line to the present and how current Russian President Vladimir Putin is developing and possibly getting ready to use bioweapons. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's very important. People don't know the background of Putin, unfortunately. Putin's grandfather was Stalin's cook and Stalin's taster. Stalin was himself poisoned, as the book Dancer and Devil goes into at some length, in 1953. Putin's grandfather would have been there probably that night. Putin's father was an actual exterminator in the Ukraine for Stalin. His job was to follow the Red Army through the Ukraine and shoot people in the back of the head who were politically unreliable. So when Putin talks about denazification of the Ukraine, he's a chip off the old KGB block. He grew up in the KGB. His ideology is human life has no value. He says that Stalin was a great man who was simply misunderstood, and that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was history's greatest tragedy. And that explains exactly why he's pursued the Ukraine. It also explains why the Ukraine resists so fiercely. They lost 4 to 8 million people to Stalin in 1931 to 1934. All of their musicians were all killed in 1931. They were called Kobars. They were all executed and thrown in a mass grave. Likewise, in China, Xi has said that Stalin is a great man, that you can't be a good communist if you don't believe in Stalin. And he believes that total control over human life is important. And so the methodology of both Putin and Xi, with very little value for human life, and the slaughter of the Uyghurs, and in the purge of the Communist Chinese Party, which has lost a third of its members in the past 9 years, is exactly the same methodology that Stalin used all those years ago in Russia to consolidate power.
Now, Sarah, are you concerned that Putin will use bioweapons if the war in Ukraine drags on?
I think it's a very real threat. In a presidential debate in 2012, his army was being criticized, and he said, yes, but you know nothing about our biological capabilities. I do think it's a threat, and it's also, we hear about the threat of nuclear war, which is, of course, terrible. But in this nuclear stalemate, someone can cough in Kansas, and all of a sudden there's smallpox in Kansas. And where did it come from? We're not sure. And by the way, the Russians have been vaccinating against smallpox. We saw how COVID-19 took down the world. As we discuss in The Dancer and the Devil, there are biochemical labs in biowar labs in Russia and in China, military biowar labs that are working on much more dangerous things than COVID-19. So yes, I believe it's a very real threat, and it's one of the reasons that we wrote the book, to educate people.
In 1977, Jesse, the Chinese had preserved a flu from 1955 called the Chinese flu at that time. Went all over the world, and in 77, exactly the same flu showed up again, and it killed over 1 million people in the world. I got it. You may have gotten it. It was in 1977. Many virologists said this can't be. It's impossible, because the flu bug from 77 was exactly the same as the flu bug in 55, and they said the Chinese have to preserve this in a lab. The Chinese said, oh, not us. We don't know anything about it. What are you talking about? In 1994, as our book, The Dancer and the Devil reflects, citing the exact sources, the head of the Chinese virology program said, yes, I'm sorry. The truth is we were conducting vaccine tests with our army on the 1955 virus, and it just got loose. And that's how the 1977 virus went all over the world. So it's happened before, over and over again. It happened in Russia on occasion after occasion. There are journals in Russia where the people who worked on the bioweapons program laugh about what's called the bioweapons Chernobyl at Ekaterinburg in 1979, which killed over 1,000 people from a leak of anthrax. They laugh about how they were required to shoot stray dogs, and how people tried to pretend it wasn't a leak out of their own bioweapons lab. So it's a great danger to the world, and there is a real chance of these people using it. These are people who don't regard human life as important. It's the ideology that's important. It's the state that's important, and we're all just servants of the state.
Well, as John has mentioned, Putin is definitely a son of Stalin. His mentor, actually, Anatoly Sobchak, when Putin took power, Sobchak was asked, who is Putin? And his response was, Putin is the new Stalin. Shortly after that, Sobchak died of a heart attack, and his 2 bodyguards also had simultaneous heart attacks, none of whom had any coronary problems prior.
Now, I want to get our callers in this conversation, but I can't let this go since you just mentioned the Asian flu of 1977. Do you think that COVID-19 was developed as a biological weapon, knowing what you know?
I do. I don't think that it was intentionally released. I think that the release of COVID-19 was an accident. But COVID-19 is rather clearly a manufactured virus to me. The evidence for it is almost overwhelming. The COVID virus comes from a bat located 1,100 miles from Wuhan, China, in the Himalayas. It's only been discovered there. That's the only place in the world that anything like COVID has been discovered. We know it went to Wuhan and was taken to the Wuhan virology lab in 2015. We know that because there are articles in Science and elsewhere that recite that it was taken there, a horseshoe bat with that particular virus. When the virus appeared in 2019, it was in slightly different form. About 3.8% of it was different. It was different than any virus that's ever been found anywhere in the world. In Wuhan is a huge military bioweapons lab. My opinion is that the bat virus that was taken in 2015 to Wuhan from 1,100 miles away, that it wasn't somebody munching in a laboratory. It was ridiculous that a bat flew 1,100 miles, but that bat virus was altered and that inadvertently it was released, probably in the course of vaccine tests, exactly as happened in 1977.
Now, Sarah, hold on before you respond. I want to read this from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. This is the statement from them about what they said in 2021. We, the intelligence community, judge the virus was not developed as a biological weapon. Most agencies also assess with low confidence that SARS-CoV-2 was probably was not genetically engineered. However, two agencies believe that there was not sufficient evidence to make an assessment either way. Finally, the intelligence community assesses China's officials did not have foreknowledge of the virus before the initial outbreak of COVID-19 emerged. Are they wrong, Sarah?
They are wrong,
Well,
as we present
they're partly
in
wrong.
The Dancer and the Devil.
We think that the release of the virus was inadvertent. We don't disagree. We don't believe that they intentionally released the virus.
Jump back in there,
Go
Sarah.
ahead.
John, yeah, well, I'd love to. John and I are both lawyers, and we wrote the last part of the book much like we'd be arguing a legal brief. I think it's a pretty slam dunk case. If you look at, in addition to everything John said about us knowing they were doing research on this bat that carries the virus that's so similar to COVID-19, we know that Dr. Lee, who was the whistleblower, who said there's this strange virus showing up in Wuhan, he was, we think, killed shortly thereafter. He died of COVID-19 at the age of 35 in wonderful health. Less than 1.5% of people with his age and health died from COVID. All of the initial evidence was destroyed across the board. The WHO was not allowed to research it until a year after the release. Everyone on the board was elected by the Chinese government, and they still have not been allowed to research this secret military lab that worked in conjunction with the Wuhan virology lab that we've discussed. I think the evidence is quite overwhelming that it was manufactured in the lab.
Jesse, all the early forensic samples, in other words, all the early blood samples, they were all immediately destroyed on orders of the Chinese Military Bioweapons Command that was brought into Wuhan. So you're never going to find those. They were all destroyed. My experience as a lawyer is that when people destroy evidence, there's only one reason to destroy evidence, and that reason is because the evidence is so much worse than even the fact of destruction. So what you have is what is commonly called res ipsa loquitur, the appearance of this virus on the doorstep of a military lab that has the bat in hand, like nowhere else in the world, that's engaged in alteration of viruses. And then you have them destroying stuff. The doctor who discovers it is charged with releasing state secrets, and then he dies very quickly. This is, I'm happy to try it to any jury. Of course, the Xi government will never allow it to ever be tried anywhere.
Well, let's get some of our viewers into this conversation. Let's start with David, who's calling from Glasgow, Kentucky. David, good morning.
Hey, thank you. This is really amazing that they've worked to get all this history. Evidently, John McCain was right. He said you're looking into the eyes of a killer when you look at Putin. And we do, from this, he's the most dangerous man in the world. And it's amazing that we've had a U.S. president that's held up for Putin and still does to some extent from what I can find out. And I wonder, can Putin kill anyone at any time, any place in the world? And I also want you to comment on the religion in Moscow and Russia, the Orthodox religion. Doesn't Putin tell the church what to believe and do over there? That's my comment. Thank you.
David, that's what he does. The Russian Orthodox Church, which is a wonderful church, lost everybody in Soviet times. There were 127,000 priests killed in the year 1926 to 1928, and so it became a chimera of itself. It has been thrown out of the International Orthodox Church because it's a KGB front. And so they give services on what a great war it is in the Ukraine and how wonderful it is to be killing the Ukrainians. It's a KGB church. It's not a Christian church as we think of churches in the United States. Putin is a guy who said that Stalin and Lenin should be canonized as Christian saints. Now understand, this is Stalin who killed 127,000 priests, and Lenin and Stalin who said that the very words God will be gone in the Soviet Union by 1935. In terms of his ability to kill people, he has a group called Unit
29155.
29155. 29155 first got exposed in 2018 when a videotape of them, when they poisoned two people called Scruples in England, and a videotape happened to catch who they are. Amazingly, people found them on Facebook, where they idiotically were posting. From that, the British secret police were able to track them back, and they had killed at least 14 people in Russia. In England alone, through killing them. And so he kills people all over the world.
Let's talk to Ed, who's calling from Danbury, Connecticut. Ed, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. Given that the new threats are either enhanced versions of old viruses or possibly even completely new, have you taken a look at what we should do in order to be ready for any particular threat from this? And are we doing it? Is our government actually pursuing avenues to ward off this threat?
We were terribly prepared. And, as the COVID virus shows us, we have, look at the terrible suffering in the United States, 1,100,000 people so far killed, 100,000, we're losing hundreds of people a day right now with 3 times the number of COVID cases we had a year ago. And so we're very badly prepared. We've done a few things, like we've prohibited enhancement experiments, at least by our own pharmaceutical companies. Amazingly, pharma was insanely enhancing viruses to make them more communicable in laboratories on the theory they'd never escape. We've at least prohibited that, but we're terribly unprepared. And the reason for the book, and the reason we went through 4 years of agony of writing the book, was precisely because it all begins with people knowing the truth. It begins with people actually knowing that Putin and Xi, exactly as the prior caller said, are very, very bad people. These are not people whose eyes you can look in who are nice guys. They're not nice guys. They're really, really bad. And second, the bioweapons that they possess and the refinements they've made of them present a terrible threat to humanity.
It's also been surprisingly difficult to get this story out. When we were first reaching for a publishing house, we spoke with several big houses in New York who said, we're interested in the Stalin and Pavlova story, but we don't want to talk about Putin and Xi. Well, at that point, COVID-19 had hit and was affecting everyone, and we saw it as a direct extension from Laboratory 1, and we thought this is the full story. It needs to be told. Also, surprisingly, in the course of researching it, I operate a different, wholly separate website unrelated to the book, and I noticed that I was getting hits from Wuhan and Shanghai while I was doing all of this research. We have 650 endnotes, and my IP address must have been flagged. Well, one morning I opened the manuscript to work on it, and I noticed that it had been opened at 4 a.m. I was asleep at 4 a.m., and I was the only one that had access to the manuscript. John didn't even have it. So at that point, we contacted the FBI. They had us turn my computer over to a computer forensic expert. He ran multiple tests, as did Apple, gave him my Apple password, my home Wi-Fi password. And then shortly thereafter, this would have been in September of 2001, I opened the manuscript to work on it, and all previous versions had been deleted, absolutely wiped. And I would save them by date. I could see that the last probably year's worth of manuscripts were gone. Our computer forensic expert was able to determine that the breach happened in the cloud, not in my Wi-Fi system. But I think that's a real threat that this book was trying to be, they clearly were trying to suppress this message. And to your point, it's a message that the world needs to know about.
There was a good deal of information in the book that the book is heavily annotated with 650 footnotes. And you can actually, if you buy it on Kindle, you can actually flash and it'll take you right to the source, and you can then read the source. And it's heavily documented, but some of the information that led us along the way were from people in Russia and in China, and so that's what they were looking for, but they didn't find it because none of it's in any computer anywhere.
And fortunately, I'd saved the manuscript on a flash drive, otherwise we would have lost a year's worth of work.
All right, let's.
You asked me. I think the U.S. government, in particular the NIH, as the early emails in January of 2019 say, wait, if people learn about this, they'll be anti-science, or they'll hate China. Well, I don't hate China. I think it's one of the great civilizations on earth, and I'm certainly not anti-science, but science is about truth. So I think we got committed to trying to sort of tell a story and pretend, as we did with Hitler in the 1930s, pretending, wait, he was going to make the trains run on time. It was all going to be good. And that's not what's happening. That's not the truth of it.
Well, let's talk to Charlie, who's calling from Roslyn Heights, New York. Charlie, good morning.
Hey, everybody. How you doing? I'm enjoying this conversation, but, usually I found out that the truth is very complex. I feel like these two people are really bashing Stalin, and if what they're saying is true, they should be bashing him. At the same time, Stalin played a very important part in getting rid of Nazism and Hitler. As a patriotic American, I'm happy for that. How do they feel about that?
Well, I think you're right. I think, first of all, I do think Stalin's role is a little overplayed. Early on, remember, Stalin signed a treaty with Hitler dividing Poland. And so Stalin initially accommodated Hitler's invasion and destruction of France. And then he had the Soviet Union completely unprepared in the early days of the Second World War, when the Soviet Union lost millions of troops and almost lost the war. I do think that Stalin's order to hold fast in places like Stalingrad was integral to the Soviets being able to hold off Hitler, and hold off Hitler in time that with other aid, Hitler could be beaten. So I think Stalin deserves credit for that. And there is good and bad, as you say, in everybody. It wasn't necessary to kill 20 million Russians to accomplish that. It wasn't necessary to purge all the people on the all the early Bolsheviks in order to accomplish that, or to purge his own army, which left him unprepared. So there is some good, but there's a great deal of bad, I'm afraid, with Stalin, more than with almost anybody in the 20th century.
There's a campaign underway in Russia to rehabilitate Stalin, to make him more like a hero. And Putin believes Stalin was a great man that just ran into some difficulties. I find a very hard time finding anything good about Stalin. Don't mean to laugh, but goodness, after researching this book, I think you'd have a hard time finding a more evil man.
But it's interesting because Stalin started in a seminary. Stalin actually, his mother was a wonderful woman. By all accounts, his father was a terrible, abusive drunk. She got him into a seminary. He was there, and without previewing, you'll have to look at The Dancer and the Devil for the whole story, but he went south bad, became a police informer. He killed his comrades, Bolshevik comrades. He had birthday parties where they would stage the death of his closest friends. I mean, imitate them, how they had died, make fun of them as they died. So it's very hard to have this as a guy that you'd really love. His daughter, Svetlana, tells the story of his death when he was poisoned in 1953. We've learned only in later years through Molotov's biography, through the biography of Khrushchev, and through work by Professor Jonathan Brent, then of Yale, that Stalin was poisoned with warfarin, stomach poison, that caused him to bleed out on his stomach. So as he died, he suddenly became conscious and began waving his hands and screaming. And his daughter Svetlana says it was as if the angel of death was coming to collect Stalin. And I have trouble believing that in his last minute, Stalin wasn't looking at all those 20 million people he killed. But even the devil gets his due, and Stalin certainly played a big role in the last half of World War II and the success in defeating the monster Hitler.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, so I want to thank John O'Neill and Sarah Wynne, co-authors of The Dancer and the Devil, Stalin, Pavlova, and the Road to the Great Pandemic, for being with us this morning. Sarah, John, thank you so much.
Thank you for
Jess.
having us. If you'd like to see photographs or other information we've collected, I invite you to visit our website, www.danceranddevil.com. Thank you, Jesse, so much for having us on.
And I'd also like to thank all of our guests and all of our viewers and all of our social media followers for another great Washington Journal. Have a great Sunday, everyone. Continue to wash your hands and stay safe. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 7 a.m.